So like I said, there's a huge variety in transit lines. Here's that light rail graph again. You can see Pittsburgh down there. You can see some of the lines up at the top carrying vastly more people. So why those differences? I would say it comes down to these basic factors: density, activity, walkability, connectivity, frequency, travel time, reliability, capacity, and last, legibility. So let's talk about those and why they matter. First of all, let's start with density. Why does density matter? Density matters because it's how many people you can serve with each of your stops. Obviously, if you build light rail into the middle of a cornfield, there are no people to get on it, and you will not get ridership. We impact density in a lot of ways. What this means is that land use planning is one of the biggest factors in the success of transit. For example, a city like Portland, which limits zoning in many of its neighborhoods, especially, I will note, more affluent and whiter neighborhoods, to single-family houses, thereby preventing development of new housing in those neighborhoods, is effectively limiting the ability of the transit network to serve more people, because it's giving fewer people the option of living near that transit. Now, one of the things we often talk about is, instead of building transit to density, let's build it someplace where there's development potential. And people get really excited about that. And there's some very dramatic examples. On the left is what the City Line Bush Station in Dallas used to look like. It was literally empty fields. On the right, you see what it looks like today: 2.6 million square feet of office space, 4,000 residential units, retail and restaurants. Amazingly, it's getting less ridership than when it was empty fields. TOD built around lines often is more about development than it is about actually being useful for transit. In this case, you built a lot of new development with a lot of parking on the outer end of a radial rail line that actually makes trips to this site very roundabout. If you happen to live on the same rail line, you're good. If you're on another rail line, you have to go all the way to downtown Dallas and back out. So building TOD in a place where transit isn't actually very useful probably doesn't do a whole lot of good. What I would say is much more useful is that often we can find the best opportunities for transit-oriented development are actually in corridors that already have development. It's infill. It's looking at those vacant lots and seeing what those can be. And there's obviously opportunities like that in Pittsburgh, as we can see here in East Liberty. Now, the question here, obviously, is who are we building that TOD for? And so we have adequate proof in Pittsburgh that transit can attract new development and that new development can put people right next to transit stations. The question is, what can be done to make sure that people can actually afford to live there? But in the end, density is one of the prime factors of transit, and what I see over and over again in the United States is our transit networks don't do a good job of serving the density that already exists. This is Dallas, the footprint of frequent transit in Dallas. Notice how many of those dark red dense places there are that the transit doesn't reach. And what successful transit does is it really seeks out that density. Here's an example in Honolulu, where you have a rail transit line that does an excellent job of basically picking up all the places where the most people are. That's what transit wants to do. Pittsburgh is kind of an ironic example that way, because the light rail line is actually in one of the lower density parts of the city for various historical reasons. And the busway, because it was built along a railroad track, tends to skirt density rather than go through the middle of it. What you'll really notice looking at this is there are some real pockets of density here in Pittsburgh, some of the densest neighborhoods in the city that are not served by these fixed guideways. And when we talk about density, again, we shouldn't get confused about the relationship between density and low income. This is a map of density. This is a map of low income neighborhoods. Often our densest places are actually low income. That if we are serving density, don't imagine in your head that density is a bunch of new luxury condos. Oftentimes, density is a bunch of aging houses which have multiple families live in, older apartment complexes. A lot of our densest places are actually low income, and that means service in those places is both essential and a lifeline service, but it will actually also be high ridership service.